Okay, so the first thing you're going to need to do is lay out all your parts. Here I have my case, my motherboard, my heatsink, my processor, my RAM, my graphics cards, my power supply and its cables, my extra fan, my hard drive, my screws, and my SLI bridge, and my screwdriver. Okay, now the next thing you're going to need to do is open up the case. On my case, the Corsair 500R, the side panel is simply attached with 2 thumb screws. Once these are removed, it slides right off, revealing the inside of the case. Now, I already have most of my fans installed, as you can see. I have 2 in the top, 1 on the back, 2 in the front, although one of them you can't see behind the drive cage, and 1 on the other side of the drive cage. Now, the first thing we're going to put in our case is the power supply. For my computer, I have the Antec High Current Gamer 750 watt. To attach this, we're going to aim the fan down, and so that the label is being shown. Like so. To attach it, we simply add some screws to the back. Now, these screws screw onto the back of the computer case right here. What you're going to need to do is hold up the power supply so that the screw holes are matching up with the back of the case, where the screw holes should already be shown, and screw them in like so. It may take a little bit of effort to hold the power supply in the right spot, but once it is held in that spot, it should stay. Here we go. Make sure these screws don't go in crooked. There we go. Now, we're going to need to take the 2 non-modular power supply cables, modular meaning they can be connected and disconnected on the back of the power supply, and thread them through to the back of the case, like so. The reason for doing this is so that the air can easily move through in the front of the case, so that all parts of the computer can be easily cooled. Okay, now we're going to install the motherboard. The first part we're going to need, where is it, is the back cover. This shows the ports that are on the back. Now, to attach this, you simply slide it in over here and push until it clicks. Now that will be secure in spot, and it will match up with the ports on the back of the motherboard here. Now we're going to need to install the motherboard into the case. To do this, first make sure that there are these little raised screw holes. My computer has 3 built in, as well as 6 that are not built in. These keep the motherboard slightly up from the case to prevent scratching. Now, line up the back of the motherboard with the cover that you just put on and slide it in. Next, we're going to install the processor, which in my case is the i7 4770K. Now, what you're going to need to do is locate the two notches on the processor. In my case, they're here and here. Then, you're going to have to come back to the motherboard and look for this little compartment here. Then you're going to need to push down this lever, slide it out, and lift it up. Then you're going to need to locate the two corresponding notches on here. Then line them up and slowly set it down on top. Make sure you do it super gently so you don't bend any of the small pins. Then you can lower this down and pull down the lever. Don't worry if you have to use lots of pressure, as that's normal. Slide it back under. Processor is now installed. Next, we're going to install the heatsink, which in my case is just the normal stock Intel one. First, you're going to need to make sure these arrows on each of the 4 pegs are pointing in towards the fan. Then you can set it down right on top of the processor, lining up the 4 pins with the 4 pegs at the 4 holes, and you're going to set it down and pop them in. Then you can rotate the pegs so the arrow is facing away from the processor, from the fan. And then push them in again, making sure you hear them click. Then you can take this white little cable and make sure you plug it into the white little hole right here. There you go. Now the fan will cool the processor. Next, we're going to install the RAM, which in my case is 4 4GB sticks of Crucial Ballistics Tactical Memory. Now, if you only have 2 sticks, you're going to need to make sure they are plugged into corresponding colors on the motherboard. So for example, my motherboard has 2 black and 2 gray slots. You'd need to make sure if you only had 2, you either plug them both into the gray or both into the black. That way they can move faster. Okay, now you're going to need to look for the small side between the gap here and line it up with the small side of the slot. And then just line it up and push it in, making sure both of these sides click in. And repeat for all 4 sticks. There we go. Now next, we're going to install the graphics card. Normally you'd only have 1, but in my case I have 2. 2 GeForce GTX 760 EVGA SuperClock graphics cards. Now, what you're going to do is line up this slot here with the corresponding slot on the motherboard, making sure you use the top 2. Those ones are faster than the rest. Now you just need to line it up and make sure these 2 pegs here go beside the motherboard in here. Then line it up and just slide it down on top. When you push it down, you should feel a click and it should stay fairly secure. Now, if you have 2 graphics cards, you're going to need to use the next topmost one. In my instance, this one here. Then, for my case, your screws may look a little different. We're going to use the screws that look like this. They're somewhat like the thumb screws that you use to take off the panel. And those can just simply go right in here. If you can't get them in by hand, you can use a screwdriver. Screw the insert nice and tight, but not too tight. Just secure enough that they'll hold the graphics card in place. Now, for the gaps in between the graphics cards, to keep your computer looking nice, you can use these small panels to cover up the gaps. I have a gap right here, for example. Now I can slide this in. There we go, and it'll cover up that hole nicely in between the graphics cards. There we go, now let's just give those a nice little tighten. There we go. Go. There we go. Now, because there's two graphics cards, you're going to need something called an SLI bridge. So it's something like this. This just connects the two and gives extra bandwidth so they can communicate with each other. You just plug it in like this. There we go. Next, we're going to install the hard drive. In my case, it's a 1 terabyte Seagate Barracuda plain hard drive. These go in the hard drive bays over here. Now, most computers would have 2 hard drive bays, as mine came with. But for better airflow, because I only need one, because I only have 1 hard drive, I removed the other one, so the air can move around better. Now, I have screwless bays, meaning normally you have to screw it in, but in this case you don't. So all I need to do is line up these little tabs with the screw holes and click it in. Like so. Then I can just slide it into one of the empty bays. Click it in, and I'm good to go. Next, we're going to get all the cables on the power supply. Now, my power supply was semi-modular, meaning only some of the cables are built in. The rest you need to attach yourself. This way, you don't have as many cables in your computer because you only need to plug in the ones you need. Now, power connectors look like this. So, for each of these graphics cards, I need a 6-pin and an 8-pin. Each one of these cables has 1 6-pin and 1 8-pin, which means I need 2 of these ones, as well as my hard drive needs 1 SATA, which looks like this. My motherboard, for an extra SLI power, needs 1 SATA as well, and that plugs in here. And to power the fans, I need 1 Molex, which is one that looks like this. So I need these 3 cables. Now, my power supply also has 2 rails, which means it basically has 2 different power sections. So for better power going throughout the whole thing, I'm going to plug 1 graphics card into each section, like so. Click. And click. Now I can push these through to the back, although I'm not going to do that yet. And then I need this one, which will plug into one of the slots on the bottom. There. Now I'm going to install the extra fan. which in my case is this Noctua 120mm fan. Now, you may notice something weird. Not so much with mine, because I've already had them screwed in at one point in time, but with yours, that these holes here have no screw threads. So what this means is you need to use self-threading screws, meaning as you drive the screw in, it makes a thread for itself. These screws are sharper, and they look like this. So, what you're going to do is, because this one's on the bottom, I'm going to take off my dust filter, slide this down, there we go. I'm going to attach it here. Now, the side with the label is the side the air comes out of. So, what this means is on the bottom, I'm going to want the air going into the power supply, because hot air rises, and the whole point of these fans is to get rid of hot air. Which means these ones are going to be aimed out, this one on the back is going to be aimed out, and these ones are going to be aimed in. So, I'm going to make sure this one is aimed in as well. Now I'm going to put the side of the wire near this hole so that I can route it through to the back. So I can slide this in here, and then get out my screwdriver, line it up with the holes. Sorry about that, my camera cut off. So what I'd said was, you're going to need to make sure you put lots of pressure on these screws, as because they are making the thread, they need lots of force to do so. You'll probably not be able to start all these screws by hand, as I already have threads, but yours won't. Make sure these screws are super secure, otherwise your fan could vibrate, and that would cause loud noises. There we go. Okay, now we have all the components installed. So now we need to make sure all these cables plug into where they should go. Give me a second while I change the camera angle. Okay, so while I was off camera, I've moved all the cables that were attached to the power supply through this bottom slot here and out into the behind the case. The point is, we need the least amount of cables inside the case so that the air doesn't get blocked by anything, because the air is what cools your whole computer. So, to do this, we need to make sure that the cables come out of these holes in only the spots they have to. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is plug in all these cables, which are the cables that power the front of the case, as you can see here. All these cables here need to make sure they plug into the motherboard so that each of these ports knows what to do. So, to do this, we're going to need to plug each of these into the correct slot on the motherboard. Now, each of these cables has a purpose, and they'll usually say it right on them. For example, this one says USB 3.0. Probably won't be able to see that in the footage, but that's what it says. So, the USB port, the USB 3.0 cord I just showed you, plugs in right here. See where it says USB 3.0_2? So, what we're going to need to do is plug the USB 3.0 cord, which is this big thick one here, and take it and plug it through the one down here, because it's the closest one to the motherboard, and slide it all the way through. We can always push back the cord we don't need after. Sorry about that. Then we're going to plug it into this port right here. Now, when we do this, oh, sorry, I knocked over my flashlight. Okay, so now, when we do this, we're going to need to make sure that we don't bend any of those small pins, as I know firsthand that that's very easy to do. So, make sure it's plugged in the right way. There's a little notch right on the top of the USB cord that should match up with a notch on the port. And then slide it in. Nice and slow. Once it clips in, you're good to go. And we push back the cord we don't need into the back of the case, like so. Now, for the next cords. The next cords we're going to plug in are the front panel headers. These all come attached on this ribbon cable here. These are things like the power button or just the little light behind the power button. Those also plug in near the USB port, so those can slide right in there too. Okay, so each of these front panel headers does a simple task. These can range from the power button to a simple LED. So, what we're going to do, sorry about this, there we go. Sorry about that, my flashlight was giving me issues. So now we're going to need to plug in these front panel headers. Each one of them should have a little label on it saying what it does. For example, this one says power switch. This one says HDD LED, and it shows which side's the positive and which side's the negative. This one says minus P LED, and etc. So now, what you're going to need to do is look at the label. Like this one says Reset SW. And you're also going to need to look at the label below here. This explains what each little color-coded section on this does. For example, Reset SW is right here. So, what you're going to do is line it up and plug it in. Nice and simple. There we go. Okay, now next we're going to plug in the rest of them. This one here says Power SW. So that also just needs to line up with the right one. Like right here, PW, minus and plus. That plugs in right there. Now, like you've seen, sometimes the labels don't quite match up. So you're going to have to use your better judgment to figure out what they mean. This one's minus and plus HDD LED, which is right here. HD minus and plus. Now make sure the plus side lines up with the plus side of this switch. So for example, this one needs to plug in upside down. There we go. Next we've got minus P LED. So right here we've got P LED, minus and plus. So this one just needs to go right onto the minus pin. Sorry about that. It's very awkward to try and do this around the camera. Here, just let me figure this out off camera. There we go. Sorry about that. I finally got that plugged in. Next we've got plus PLED. So that one goes in right beside it. There we go. That's all of them. Now, as you'll notice, there's lots of blank ones. That's because my case doesn't support those functions, although yours might, which is why you need to figure out which ones you need. Okay, now the next set of cords we're going to plug in is going to be this one. So, one Molex connector, the one on the top here, is going to be needed to power the fans. So we'll plug that in, like so. There we go. Now, we need one to power the SLI connector in here. So we'll slide that in there for now. And we need one for the hard drive, which can go down like this. There we go. Now let's cut around to the front. Okay, now you might not be able to see it very well, but right here is a SATA connector. Now we're going to take this one we passed through and clip that in right there. There we go. Now it'll power, that gives extra power to both graphics cards, allowing me to have two. Now we're going to plug the hard drive in. To do that, we're going to need a data cable, unlike those ones that do power, that looks something like this. Now, this cable is going to plug into the back of the hard drive, like so. Right here. Plug it in there. And then we're going to feed this in through the middle, because that's in the same section as the SATA power connector that did the same, that allowed me to have both graphics cards. Now right here is where the cord goes into. It looks sort of like a USB port hub. So we're going to plug it into one of the first black ones, like so, and slide the rest of the cable back in. Next, we're going to plug in the power for the motherboard and the graphics cards. The motherboard power connector is the really long one that looks like this. The graphics cards are the ones I showed earlier that look like this. They usually have multiple connectors on it. I have two of these because I have two graphics cards. Now, the motherboard power connector slot is near the top, so we're going to slide this in here. Now, one of the graphics cards is closer to the bottom, so we'll slide this in here. One of them is in the middle, so we'll slide it in here. Now, the motherboard also needs power to power the processor. That processor power connector is way up at the top of the motherboard. So we're going to feed it in through this little hole right here. Like so. Now let's move around to the front. First we'll plug in the power cables for the graphics cards. Like this. So, now both of these connectors have 8 pins, but one of them, 2 of the pins can come off to the side, which we're going to need to do because one of these is only 6, while one is 8. So, we'll plug the 6 in over here, like so. making sure it clips in nicely. There. And then the 8-pin in, right beside it. Making sure they both click in nicely. There we go. We'll do the same for the ones down here on the bottom. Seem to be a little tangled. There we go. Okay. Now, like I said, 6-pin. And then an 8-pin right beside it. And we can push out the rest of the cable back through, and we're good to go. Also push this back in from the fan headers. There we go. Next we're going to plug in the motherboard, which connector looks something like that. So we're just going to bring this around, plug it in like so. Again, making sure you push it in until it clicks nicely and it won't come out. Lastly, we need to plug in the power to the processor. This can be 4 or 8 pins, depending on how good your processor is. If you're using your computer for simple tasks, such as word processing or browsing the internet, your motherboard may only come with 4, whereas for gaming computers like this one, it'll need 8. This is just like the other ones. You're going to need to plug in. Just this one is split in 2, meaning you have to plug in one, and then the other right beside it. Like so. Okay, now the last things we need to plug in are the front audio and the fans. Now, as we have multiple fans, there's going to be lots of fan ports all throughout the motherboard, and they all look something like that, where it says SysFan2. Some may be 3 pins, and some may be 4 pins, depending on the slot. So, what we're going to do is route some of the cables through. Here I've already put the HD audio through the slot closest to it, and we're just going to plug it in. Now, as you can see, my cord says HD audio on it, and this one says F audio. So again, you're going to need to use your judgment to figure out where each of these need to go. There we go. Now, the fans are the same thing. Here when it's routed through the outside. Same thing. You simply have to plug it in. Like so. Will only fit one direction, so don't worry, you can't put it in backwards. Now, like I said, there's going to be lots of these all around the motherboard. Now that the fans have been plugged in, we're almost done our computer. Now, the last step is simply to organize the back. You can do this with something as simple as zap straps or anything like that. I'm not going to, but I will do it later. As this is personal preference, you can organize it however you'd like. So now that we're done, we can slide this panel back on. And attach the thumb screws. Oops. Sorry about that. There we go. Sorry, because I haven't organized the cables very well, means there's lots of pressure going up against this back panel. There we go. Now, we can do the same with the front panel. like so. But the front panel has a fan on it. So what this means is we're going to need to find the connector, which I put here. And before we attach the side panel, I'm going to need to attach this here. Slide this back under, and then we're good to go. Put the front panel on. Secure the thumb screws. And your computer's done. Now, all you need to do is enter the BIOS and set up an operating system. It's that easy.